The colony on Xylos was officially designated Provisional Settlement 3, but the colonists called it Hope's Landing. It was a name born of defiance rather than observation. Xylos was a world of breathtaking, savage beauty. Vast, rust-colored jungles steamed under a pale green sky, and the air was thick with the scent of alien pollen and damp earth. For the 500 souls of Hope's Landing, it was a constant, grinding struggle for survival. The colony was a small, domed island of sterile Earth normalcy in an ocean of overwhelming and often hostile alien biology. Dr. Aris Thorne, the colony's chief xenobotanist, spent his days analyzing the native flora, hoping to find the key to their long-term survival, a viable food crop, a new medical compound, anything to loosen the tight, unforgiving leash of their supply shipments from home. The first case presented as a simple sore throat. A young surveyor named Elias Vance had returned from a week-long expedition into the fungal forests of the western continent, complaining of a persistent, dry cough. Aris, who doubled as the colony's primary physician, had prescribed standard anti-inflammatories and ordered a day of rest. But Elias's condition didn't improve. His throat became raw, his voice raspy, and he spoke of a strange, vibrating sensation in his larynx, as if a tuning fork were perpetually ringing in his throat. Within a week, a dozen more colonists, all of whom had worked with the geological samples Elias had brought back, presented with the same symptoms. Aris isolated the pathogen with grim efficiency. It was a fungus, an airborne spore of a type he had never seen before. Under the electron microscope, it was horrifically elegant, a network of mycelia that seemed to grow with a terrifying, deliberate intelligence. It wasn't attacking the host's body in a conventional way. It wasn't causing necrosis or consuming tissue for sustenance. Instead, it was repurposing it. The mycelia were weaving themselves into the soft tissues of the throat, integrating with the larynx, the trachea, and the vocal cords, turning the delicate fleshy structures into something new. They were reinforcing them with a chitinous, biological lattice, making them tougher, more resilient, and horrifically efficient at resonating. The fungus wasn't an infection. It was an upgrade. The first sign that something was truly fundamentally wrong came from the colony's bioacoustic sensors. The faint, ever-present hum of the jungle had begun to change. The nocturnal predators of Xylos, sleek, six-legged hunters the colonists called stalkers, were becoming more active, their hunting grounds shifting from the deep jungle to the perimeter of the colony. It was as if they were being called, drawn in by a sound that the human ear could not yet perceive, but that their own senses could pick up with perfect hungry clarity. They were gathering, waiting for a dinner bell to ring. The first shriek tore through the sterile quiet of the medical bay 2 weeks after the initial outbreak. Elias Vance, patient 0, was the first to mature. He had lost the ability to speak days earlier, his voice reduced to a painful, vibrating hum. Aris Thorne was by his bedside, adjusting a nutrient drip when Elias's body went rigid. His back arched, his jaw locked open, and a sound erupted from his throat that was unlike anything Aris had ever heard. It was not a human scream of pain or terror. It was a high-frequency, perfectly sustained, and inhumanly loud shriek, a blade of pure, piercing sound that shattered the glass of a nearby instrument panel and sent Aris staggering back. His hands clamped over his ears. The sound was agonizing, not just in its volume, but in its texture. It was the sound of a living being turned into an organic siren, a scream that carried within it the echo of excruciating, unending pain. Elias's body was a biological instrument, and the fungus was the musician, playing a single, terrible note. Outside the dome of the colony, the effect was immediate. The stalkers, who had been lurking at the edge of the perimeter fence, were galvanized. The sound was a command, a summons. They surged forward, their lithe, dark bodies a wave of hungry muscle and sharp claws, crashing against the electrified fences with a new, frenzied determination. Panic ripped through Hope's Landing. The shriek from the medical bay was soon joined by others. The dozen other infected colonists, their own fungal transformations reaching maturity, began their own terrible chorus. The colony, once a place of quiet, determined work, was now filled with the sound of a dozen continuous, agonizing screams, each one a fresh invitation to the starving predators outside. The uninfected colonists huddled in the central plaza, their faces a mask of terror and disbelief. Their friends, their spouses, their colleagues had become monsters, living beacons of pain whose only function was to call the wolves to their door. The colony's administrator, a pragmatic woman named Director Eva Rostova, made the only logical choice. Following the grim calculus of survival, she ordered the infected to be moved to a single sound-proofed quarantine block at the edge of the settlement. It was a brutal, necessary decision, a choice to sacrifice a few to save the many. For other, more logical species, this would have been the end of the story. The infected would be abandoned, a tragic but necessary loss. But the colonists of Hope's Landing were human, and their logic was often contaminated by a stubborn and deeply illogical sense of loyalty. As they dragged the screaming, convulsing bodies of their friends into the quarantine block, they were not thinking about abandonment. They were thinking about a cure. Inside the quarantine block, the world was a nightmare of noise. The air vibrated, the metal walls hummed, and the screams of the 30 infected colonists merged into a single, dissonant chord of pure agony. Eris Thorne had volunteered to be sealed inside with them. He was infected himself, the telltale vibration already beginning in his own throat, and he was the colony's only hope of understanding and perhaps reversing the fungal transformation. He moved through the cacophony, his ears protected by industrial-grade acoustic dampeners, administering sedatives and nutrients to the screaming, writhing bodies strapped to medical cots. It was a scene from a medieval vision of hell, and it was his new reality. In the first few days, he felt nothing but the shared, overwhelming pain. But as his own infection progressed, as the mycelia wove their chitinous web through his larynx, something new began to emerge. He began to feel a connection, a faint, tenuous link to the other infected minds in the room. It was not telepathy in a true sense. It was a shared emotional state, a psychic resonance that rode on the carrier wave of their collective shriek. He could feel their pain, not as an observer, but as a participant. He could feel Elias Vance's terror, a young woman's grief for the family she would never see again, an old man's despair. It was a chorus of misery, a symphony of suffering. But within that symphony, Eris began to sense something else, a pattern. Each person's shriek had a unique timbre, a distinct emotional signature, and his own mind, his own consciousness, was a new instrument in the orchestra. He could feel the others reacting to his own fear and his own stubborn scientific curiosity. He was not just a receiver. He was a transmitter. The fungus had created a network, a shared consciousness born of sound and pain. Outside, the colony was under siege. The stalkers, relentless and maddened by the constant tantalizing sound, had found a weakness in the perimeter fence. They were pouring into the settlement's agricultural dome, and the small, outmatched security team was fighting a losing battle. Director Rostova's voice crackled over the quarantine block's intercom, her report grim and final. They were being overrun. There were too many. Hope's Landing was about to fall. Listening to her words, Eris looked at the screaming, helpless people around him. They were the cause of this disaster. They were the bait that had doomed them all. But as he felt the network of shared agony that connected them, a desperate, insane idea began to form in his mind. What if the bait could become the weapon? The transformation in Eris's own throat reached its agonizing climax. The constant, low vibration built to a crescendo, and his body was seized by the same uncontrollable convulsions that gripped the others. His jaw locked open, and a new voice, a new instrument, joined the hellish choir. His own shriek ripped from his lungs, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that merged with the cacophony of the room. But in that moment of ultimate involuntary pain, he did not surrender to it. He focused his mind, his scientific discipline a rock in a sea of suffering. He reached out through the psychic network, not with a command, but with a simple, focused thought. A single, pure musical note. He focused on the memory of a tuning fork from his lab, the clean, perfect tone of a middle C. He poured his will, his desperation, and his focus into that one simple concept. broadcasting it into the chaotic symphony of screams. At first, there was no response. The chorus of pain continued, a dissonant, random wall of noise. But then, one of the other minds, the consciousness of a young woman who had been a musician before the outbreak, resonated with his thought. Her shriek, which had been a high, sharp keen of grief, wavered. It dropped in pitch, a painful grating sound like a string being forcibly retuned. But it held. She had found his note. The effect was a chain reaction. Her newfound stability, her anchor in the storm of pain, was felt by the others. One by one, other minds latched on to the shared concept. Shrieks that had been random and chaotic began to modulate, to shift, to find the harmony that Eris was broadcasting. It was a horrific, ragged process, the sound of 30 souls being forced to sing from the same tortured song sheet. But it was working. Within a minute, the dissonant, chaotic noise of the quarantine block had been transformed. It was no longer a random collection of screams. It was a single, unified, and mind-shatteringly powerful chord. They didn't stop screaming. The pain was still there, a constant agonizing reality. But they were no longer just victims of it. They were conductors. Aris, feeling the collective power of the network, focused their intent. He pushed the chord higher, sharpened the frequency, and aimed it, a focused blast of pure, weaponized sound, at the metal walls of the quarantine block. The sound that emerged from the block's external speakers was no longer just a dinner bell. It was a sonic cannon. In the agricultural dome, the stalkers, who had been tearing through the last line of defense, stopped in their tracks. The new sound hit them like a physical blow, a high-frequency blade of pure, intolerable pain that targeted their sensitive auditory systems. They shrieked, a sound of animal terror that was a pale echo of the human symphony that was assaulting them, and they fled, abandoning their attack and retreating back into the stunned silence of the jungle. A new, terrifying hope had been born in the heart of the screaming. In the aftermath of the sonic assault, a profound and terrifying silence fell over Hope's Landing. The retreat of the stalkers was as sudden and total as their attack had been ferocious. In the agricultural dome, the handful of surviving security officers stood amidst the wreckage and carnage, their ears ringing, staring at the quarantine block with a mixture of awe and raw terror. The screams from within had subsided, returning to the chaotic, dissonant hum of before, but the memory of that focused, weaponized sound lingered in the air. Their saviors were the very monsters they had feared. Inside the quarantine block, the 30 members of what they were already beginning to call the choir collapsed. The effort of coordinating their shrieks, of forcing their agony into a single unified purpose, had left them utterly drained. The psychic link between them, which had been a clear, sharp channel of focused intent, dissolved back into a muddy, exhausting sea of shared pain. Aris Thorne slumped against a wall, his own throat feeling like it had been scraped raw with sharpened steel. But through the fog of exhaustion, he felt a flicker of something new, a shared sense of grim, triumphant pride. They had done it. They had turned their curse into a weapon. Director Rostova's voice, crackling over the intercom, was stripped of its usual calm authority. It was thin, strained, and filled with a disbelief that bordered on reverence. "Thorne, Aris, what was that? Are you in control of it?" Aris, unable to speak, focused his thoughts, hoping the faint psychic residue of the network could carry his intent. "Yes, we are." He felt the other minds in the room stir, adding their own weary affirmation to his. The quarantine block was no longer a prison or an infirmary. It had become a barracks, a weapon emplacement, and the most important, and most terrifying, building in the entire colony. Rostova, understanding the shift in power, did not give an order. She asked a question. "What do you need?" The relationship between the infected and the uninfected had been irrevocably altered. The cleans, as some of the choir were beginning to call them, looked upon the quarantine block with a new, fearful respect. They ferried supplies to the entrance, their movements quick and furtive, as if they were leaving offerings at the mouth of a dragon's cave. They were grateful for their survival, but they were terrified of the price. They had been saved by a choir of screaming gods, and they did not know whether to worship them or flee from them. The days that followed were a grueling exploration of their new, horrific abilities. The choir, under Eris's increasingly confident direction, began to practice. It was a process of excruciating trial and error, a series of rehearsals for a symphony from hell. They learned that the pain of their condition was the key. The more they embraced it, the more they focused on their shared suffering rather than their individual agony, the stronger the psychic link became, and the more control they had over their collective voice. They stopped using the sedatives, choosing the clarity of pure, unadulterated pain over the dull, muddying relief of medication. They moved beyond the simple, sustained chord that had repelled the stalkers. They learned to modulate, to create complex sonic frequencies and intricate, overlapping rhythms. Elias Vance, the former surveyor, discovered he had a particular talent for focusing their sound into a thin, devastatingly powerful sonic lance, a beam of pure sound that could pulverize rock and shatter reinforced plexiglass from 100 meters away. The young musician, who had first answered Eris's call, learned to weave their shrieks into a wide, disorienting field of sound, a resonance net that could induce vertigo and nausea in any creature that entered it. They were a living, breathing, and perpetually screaming sonic weapon system. The body horror of their condition became more pronounced. The fungus, seemingly adapting to its new purpose, continued its terrible work. Their necks thickened with new muscle. Their rib cages expanded to allow for greater lung capacity, and the skin around their throats became tough and leathery, a biological amplifier for the chitinous resonators within. They were becoming less and less human in appearance, their bodies grotesquely and efficiently redesigned for the sole purpose of producing their weaponized shriek. The psychological toll was immense. They lived in a state of constant shared agony, their individual identities beginning to blur at the edges. The psychic link, once a faint whisper, was now a constant flowing river of shared thoughts, memories, and emotions. They knew each other's deepest fears, most treasured memories, and most profound regrets. They were becoming a single collective consciousness with 30 mouths, a hive mind born of a fungal plague. Some railed against this loss of self, their shrieks tinged with the unique bitter flavor of their own fading individuality. Others welcomed it, finding a strange and terrible comfort in the dissolution of the lonely, fragile ego. Eris, their reluctant conductor, fought to hold them together, his own sense of self the anchor for their terrible, beautiful, and utterly monstrous new form of life. The stalkers, having learned their lesson, gave the colony a wide berth. For a time, a strange and tense peace settled over Hope's Landing. The choir practiced, the cleans worked, and the two halves of the colony coexisted in a state of fragile, fearful symbiosis. But Xylos was a world of myriad, complex dangers, and the stalkers were only its most obvious threat. The true apex predator of the planet was not a creature of tooth and claw, but something far more insidious. The colonists had called it the Whisper Wood. It was a vast, ancient forest of the same rust-colored fungi that had infected them, a single, continent-spanning superorganism. They had known it was psionically active, but they had believed its effects to be benign. A faint, low-level telepathic field that caused vivid dreams and a lingering sense of melancholy in those who spent too long near its edge. They were wrong. The Whisperwood was a psychic predator, a slow, patient hunter that fed not on flesh, but on the emotional energy of sentient beings. It had been slowly, subtly feeding on the despair and fear of the colonists since the day they had landed. The emergence of the choir had changed the equation. The powerful, focused psychic energy of the 30 networked minds was not a subtle snack. It was a banquet. The Whisperwood, which had been a passive, ambient threat, now turned its full, ancient attention upon the colony. It was not a fast or violent attack. It was a slow, deliberate siege of the mind. The cleans, unprotected by the choir's psychic network, were the first to feel its effects. A deep, unshakable despair began to settle over the colony. Tools were dropped, conversations trailed off into silence, and people would simply stop in the middle of their work, a look of profound, hopeless emptiness in their eyes. The Whisperwood was feeding on their will to live, and the choir, for all its sonic power, was helpless to stop it. Their shrieks could shatter rock, but they could not shatter a feeling. The choir felt the despair of their friends and family through a muted, second-hand sense, but they also felt the direct attention of the Whisperwood. It was a cold, ancient, and utterly alien consciousness, and it began to probe their network, seeking to infiltrate their shared mind and feast on the rich, powerful agony that bound them together. It whispered to them, not in words, but in pure conceptual despair. It showed them the futility of their struggle, the inevitability of their pain, and the sweet, peaceful release of simply giving up. The choir, which had been forged in the fires of defiance, now faced a new and terrible enemy, an enemy that did not want to kill them, but to convince them to kill themselves. The battle against the Whisperwood was a war fought in the silent, interior landscape of the choir's collective mind. The entity's psychic assault was relentless, a constant, insidious pressure that sought to turn their greatest strength, their shared pain, into their ultimate undoing. It amplified their suffering, twisted their shared memories into weapons of regret, and promised an end to their agony if they would only silence their defiant shriek and embrace the quiet, peaceful emptiness it offered. The choir began to fracture. The members who had railed against the loss of their individuality were the most vulnerable, their lingering sense of self a weak point that the Whisperwood could exploit. Their shrieks began to lose their focus, their notes wavering and falling out of harmony as they began to succumb to the sweet, logical poison of despair. Eris felt the network beginning to fail. He felt the cold, alien tendrils of the Whisperwood's consciousness wrapping around the minds of his people, pulling them down into a sea of silent, hopeless surrender. He knew that their sonic weapons were useless. This was not a battle that could be won with volume. It had to be won with purpose. He reached into the network, past the despair and the pain, and searched for a new unifying concept, a new story they could tell themselves to counteract the Whisperwood's narrative of futility. He found it in the one emotion that the Whisperwood, in its ancient alien coldness, could not comprehend: rage. He tapped into the burning, defiant anger of his own heart, the anger at the fungus, at the planet, at the universe that had inflicted this horrific fate upon them. It was not a clean or noble emotion. It was a raw, ugly, and profoundly human fury. He poured that feeling into the network, a psychic broadcast of pure, undiluted spite. They will not have us, he thought, a silent scream that was louder than any audible one. This pain is ours. This suffering is ours, and we will not give it up. The effect was electrifying. The raw, powerful energy of his rage cut through the cold, placid despair of the Whisperwood. The minds that had been wavering on the verge of surrender latched on to this new, powerful emotion. Their grief, their fear, their agony, it was all transmuted, reforged in the crucible of his anger into a single, unified, and utterly indomitable will to fight. Their shriek, which had been faltering, returned with a new and terrifying quality. It was no longer just a sound of pain. It was a sound of fury. It was a symphony of hate, a declaration of war against the very concept of despair. They aimed their new song not at the jungle, but inward, a psychic firewall of pure, weaponized rage that burned away the cold tendrils of the Whisperwood's influence. The ancient entity, for the first time in its millions of years of existence, recoiled. It had expected pain, fear, and despair, the familiar, nourishing emotions of lesser beings. It had not expected this. It had not expected fury. It had not expected a species that, when faced with the logical certainty of its own suffering, would choose not to surrender, but to get angry. Beaten and for the first time deeply confused, the Whisperwood withdrew its psychic assault, retreating to the silence of its fungal forests to contemplate the incomprehensible, illogical, and utterly terrifying nature of human rage. The choir had won, but the victory had changed them. They were no longer just survivors. They were warriors, and they had discovered a new and far more terrible song to sing. The victory over the Whisperwood left a permanent scar on the collective psyche of the choir. Their rage, once unleashed, could not be entirely put back in its cage. Their new song, the symphony of fury that had saved them, was now a permanent part of their repertoire. It simmered beneath the surface of their shared consciousness, a dark, powerful undercurrent to their constant pain. This change was not lost on the Clanes. The quarantine block, once a place of terrifying but understandable suffering, now emanated a palpable aura of menace. The choir was no longer just a group of victims who had learned to fight back. They were a predator that had tasted blood, and the rest of the colony was acutely aware of its own fragility in their presence. Director Rostova, ever the pragmatist, saw the new danger. Hope's Landing had survived the Stalkers and the Whisperwood, but now it faced a potential internal schism. The choir was their shield, but it was a shield that could just as easily become a sword. She began to subtly fortify the colony, not against external threats, but against its own saviors. Internal bulkheads were reinforced, and the security teams began quietly drilling in tactics designed to counter sonic attacks, wearing experimental armor lined with acoustic-dampening gel. A Cold War was beginning, a silent, fearful standoff between the two halves of a fractured humanity. The choir felt this shift, of course. Through the psychic residue that clung to every colonist, they felt the fear, the mistrust, the preparations being made against them. It fueled their simmering rage, creating a dangerous feedback loop. The more the Cleans feared them, the more monstrous they became. The psychic link, which had been a source of unity, was now in danger of becoming an echo chamber of paranoia and resentment. It was Elias Vance, the quiet surveyor, who saw the path forward. His mind, less focused on the grand strategy of their survival, had been cataloging the subtle nuances of their psychic network. He discovered that their rage, while powerful, was a blunt instrument. It was a roar of defiance, but it had no nuance. He began to experiment, weaving other, more complex emotions into their furious song. He took the choir's shared grief for their lost humanity and shaped it, turning it from a source of weakness into a sharp, piercing note of sorrowful determination. He took their fierce, protective love for the families they could no longer touch and forged it into a resonant, powerful chord of loyalty. He was not trying to erase their anger, but to give it purpose and texture. He was turning their raw, uncontrolled rage into a controlled, disciplined, and far more terrifying battle hymn. He was teaching the monsters how to sing. The final test of Hope's Landing, and the choir's terrible new power, arrived not from the planet, but from the stars. A ship appeared in orbit, a sleek, black vessel of unknown design that did not respond to any hails. It was not a vessel of exploration or diplomacy. It was a hunter. On board were the Cathar, the same crystalline species that had observed humanity's strange psychic defenses on other worlds. But this was not a diplomatic mission. This was an extermination fleet. The Cathar Imperium, in its cold, rigid logic, had analyzed the data on the Shivers and the Symbiotic Shriek and had come to a simple, terrifying conclusion. Humanity's emotional chaos was a plague, a destabilizing force in a logical galaxy. They were a cognitive anomaly that had to be sterilized. Their attack was silent and brutally efficient. They did not use explosives or energy weapons. They launched a single, specialized probe that landed just outside the colony's dome. The probe unfolded, revealing a complex crystalline spire that began to resonate, emitting a psionic frequency that the Cathar called the Great Silence. It was the ultimate expression of their philosophy, a psychic field that did not cause pain or fear, but simply erased emotion. It was a wave of pure, clean logic, a broadcast that methodically dismantled the complex, chaotic neural pathways that gave rise to feelings. For the Cleans, the effect was a gentle, almost pleasant descent into apathy. They simply stopped caring. Fear vanished. Hope vanished. Love vanished. They became placid, logical automatons, their faces empty, their movements efficient and without purpose. The choir felt the Great Silence as a direct existential assault. It was a psychic solvent, seeking to dissolve the complex emotional bonds that held their network together. Their pain, their grief, their rage, The Cathar weapon saw these, not as emotions, but as logical errors, corrupted data to be scrubbed from the universal hard drive. The choir's shriek began to falter, the rich, complex symphony of their shared soul being bleached of its color and texture, reduced to a single, meaningless, monotonous tone. The Cathar were not trying to kill them with despair. They were trying to cure them with logic. And it was working. The hive mind was being systematically lobotomized, its members being turned into silent, screaming, and utterly empty shells. Aris Thorn felt his own rage, the anchor of their new identity, being smoothed away, its sharp edges sanded down by the relentless, placid logic of the Cathar weapon. He felt the network dying, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The beautiful, terrible symphony they had created was being reduced to static. He saw the faces of the choir, their bodies still racked with the agony of their condition, but their minds growing quiet, peaceful, and terrifyingly blank. He knew he could not fight this with fury. How do you rage against an enemy that is offering you peace? It was Elias Vance who saved them. His mind, the one that had learned to weave nuance into their song, was the last to succumb. As the great silence washed over him, he reached into the one, final, uniquely human emotion that the Cathar, in all their logical purity, had never conceived of and had no defense against: irony. He looked at their situation, a group of humans who had become monsters to save their colony, only to be cured by a race of logical aliens who saw their monstrousness as a disease, and he found it profoundly, darkly, and hilariously absurd. He did not broadcast rage or grief. He broadcast a single powerful wave of pure, unadulterated sarcasm. He took the Cathar's offer of logical peace, and he accepted it with a silent, mocking bow. He took their great silence, and he treated it, not as a weapon, but as a punchline to a very, very long and complicated joke. He began to weave a new song, a symphony of pure, defiant absurdity. He took their pain, and he framed it as performance art. He took their screams, and he recontextualized them as a form of avant-garde, interspecies comedy. He taught the choir, not just to sing, but to laugh at the sheer cosmic ridiculousness of their own suffering. The effect on the Cathar weapon was catastrophic. The Great Silence was a program built on the assumption of a logical, predictable, emotional universe. It could process fear, anger, and despair. It could not process a joke. When faced with the choir's symphony of pure, weaponized irony, the crystalline probe began to vibrate, its own resonant frequency destabilized by an emotional concept that had no logical value. The Cathar had built a weapon to defeat kings and warriors. They had not built a weapon to defeat a court jester. Under the assault of the choir's silent, mocking laughter, the crystalline probe cracked, shuddered, and then shattered into a million pieces, its great silence broken. On the bridge of their ship, the Cathar watched their ultimate weapon fail, not to a superior force, but to a superior sense of humor. They had encountered a species whose ultimate defense was not a shield or a sword, but the ability to look at its own horrific, agonizing fate and laugh. Their logical framework could not compute this. It was a strategic and philosophical impossibility. Faced with a truth that so profoundly violated their understanding of the universe, the Cathar did the only logical thing they could do. They turned their ship around and fled, not in fear, but in a state of deep, systemic, and utterly baffled confusion. With the destruction of the probe, the Great Silence lifted. The cleans slowly returned to themselves, the color flooding back into their emotional worlds, leaving them with the confused, hazy memory of a strange and dreamless peace. But they awoke to a new sound. From the quarantine block, the shriek of the choir continued, as loud and as painful as ever. But it was no longer a sound of just pain or just rage. Woven into the terrible, beautiful symphony was a new and somehow more terrifying note. A note of dark, defiant, and deeply unsettling laughter. The story of Hope's Landing and the Symbiotic Shriek became a legend, a whispered cautionary tale told in the far corners of the galaxy. It was the story of a species that, when faced with a fate worse than death, had not just endured it, but had embraced it, transformed it, and ultimately weaponized it. They had become the monsters under their own beds, the terrifying singers of a song of pain and rage, and finally of a terrible cosmic laughter. They proved that the human spirit's capacity for survival was matched only by its capacity for absurdity, and they taught the galaxy a new and vital lesson, that in a universe full of horrors, sometimes the only logical response is to find the joke and to laugh the loudest.